In the boundless depths of Russian history, where myths of heroes and villains intertwine with harsh truths, some names burn brighter than others. Stepan Razin. To some, he is a symbol of freedom, a popular avenger who rallied the downtrodden and insulted. To others, he is a bloodthirsty brigand, a cruel chieftain whose hands are stained with innocent blood. But who was he, truly? He was a Don Cossack from a prosperous family, an experienced warrior and diplomat. His elder brother Ivan was executed on the orders of a Tsar's military governor, and this personal vendetta undoubtedly burned in Stepan's soul. He knew the value of Cossack autonomy and witnessed the growing serfdom that tightened a noose around the necks of common people. However, noble impulses were not his primary drivers. He began his career as a successful bandit, gathering around him desperate golitba, runaway serfs, bonded servants, and impoverished Cossacks. His famous campaign for plunder, for Zipun, or coats, a symbol of wealth, on the Volga and the Caspian Sea, was not an act of liberation, but a daring robbery that brought immense riches. After capturing Yaitsky town and defeating the Persian fleet, he returned to the Don with enormous spoils and an army ready for new exploits. It was then, in 1670, that Razin, no longer merely an ataman of rebellious Cossacks, became the leader of a grand uprising. He promised freedom, land, and an end to serfdom, and his words, like sparks, ignited a blaze across the entire Volga region. Tsaritsyn, Astrakhan, Saratov, Samara, Penza, cities fell one after another. The rebellion encompassed vast territories, threatening the very statehood of Russia. Tens of thousands marched under his banners, believing in a good Tsar and Tsarevich Alexei, whom Razin allegedly carried with him. But this belief was merely a cover for far more pragmatic goals. The ataman, who was a bandit, made himself a leader, and then a symbol, cloaking himself in the hopes of the people. The culmination came near Simbirsk, where Razin's forces suffered a crushing defeat from Tsarist troops. Razin, severely wounded, fled to the Don, and what was bound to happen, happened. The Cossack elders, frightened by the scale of the revolt and the threat to their own well-being, betrayed him. Stepan Razin was captured and handed over to the government. Here we must discard the romanticized image. Stepan Razin was not a pure, selfless fighter for the people's happiness, as folklore often portrays him. He was a calculating, cruel, and ambitious adventurer who masterfully exploited the despair and anger of the masses for his own interests. To truly understand Stepan Razin, one must delve into that turbulent era, into the specific environment that not only shaped him, but forged him into a unique, dangerous personality. The Don region in the 17th century was not just a river, it was an entire world. A world where the concepts of law and freedom were intricately intertwined. Here, on the border of the Muscovite Tsardom, the wild fields, and the nomadic steppes, people of a particular character were born. Daring, independent, accustomed to relying only on themselves and their sabers. Freedom here meant the absence of a landlord, but also a constant readiness to fight for survival. It was a crucible of characters, but also a breeding ground for brutality. It was in this environment that Stepan Timofeyevich grew up. Yes, his family was prosperous, which gave him certain advantages: access to weapons, military training, business skills, and even basic literacy, rare for that time. He was not a pauper from the lowest strata. This is important. He was part of the Cossack elite, a man who knew how to negotiate with Tsarist military governors, voivodes, and Turkish pashas, a man who understood the value of a word and the impact of a blow. He saw how central authority was strengthening, how Moscow was tightening the suffocating noose of serfdom around the neck of the entire country, and how this noose was reaching even the free Don, threatening Cossack privileges. But there was another, far more personal and profound motive that perhaps became the point of no return for Stepan. His elder brother, Ivan, was executed on the orders of Prince Yuri Dolgorukov, a Tsarist voivode. He was executed not for a grave crime, but for the Cossacks' unauthorized departure from state service, for a breach of discipline, essentially for an act of that very Cossack autonomy that was the essence of their being. For Razin, this was not just a blow to his family. It was a blatant violation of Cossack rights, a personal insult, a challenge. In a world where honor and reputation meant everything, such humiliation demanded retribution. This was not a noble impulse, no. It was rage, mixed with insulted dignity, with the desire to prove his strength and defiance. It was then, likely, that the image of the enemy finally formed in his mind, not just a specific voivode, but the entire system that encroached upon Cossack traditions and personal freedom. This does not mean he immediately became an ideologue of a nationwide revolution. No, he remained a pragmatic, calculating Cossack. But his brother's execution, this act of arbitrary power, changed him forever. It transformed him from a simple, albeit successful, ataman into a man obsessed with the idea of revenge, a man ready to go to any lengths to restore his trampled honor and assert his will. He saw despair gripping the common people and understood that this anger could be exploited. This was not altruism, but shrewd calculation. He realized that his personal revenge and thirst for power could be clothed in the form of a popular movement if the idea was presented correctly to the masses. Thus, personal trauma became the catalyst for a grandiose, yet fundamentally deeply egocentric, undertaking. However, Stepan Razin's personal revenge, however profound, could not by itself have stirred such masses. For his egocentric undertaking to become a nationwide catastrophe for the authorities, fertile ground was needed, and 17th century Russia was thoroughly saturated with it. The Muscovite Tsardom, like a giant octopus, relentlessly extended its tentacles, drawing more and more lands into the tight noose of centralization. This policy inevitably met with resistance, especially in the borderlands, where traditions of self-governance were still alive. But the most powerful instrument of suppression and control became serfdom. The Sobornoye Ulozhenie of 1649, the law code that became a death sentence for millions, finally bound peasants to the land, effectively turning them into disenfranchised slaves. From then on, fleeing a landlord was considered a state crime, and the search for runaways became indefinite. Peasants lost their last vestiges of freedom of movement. Their lives and destinies depended entirely on the will of their master. This was not just a law. It was a verdict that stripped the people of their last chance for personal freedom and dignity. Peasants, townspeople, and even many service people choked under the burden of exorbitant taxes. The state, exhausted by endless wars and grandiose construction projects, squeezed the last juices out of the population. Crop failures, famine, and epidemics only worsened the situation. The Salt Riot in Moscow in 1648 and the Copper Riot in 1662, these outbreaks of popular anger, brutally suppressed by Tsarist troops, were only precursors to far greater upheavals. They showed that the people's patience was at its limit, that any spark could ignite a fire of general rebellion. Added to this were deep internal divisions. Patriarch Nikon's church reform, aimed at unifying rites, led to a tragic church schism. Millions of old believers who did not accept the innovations were alienated from the official church and state. These old believers often became centers of opposition, seeing the Tsarist authority as the Antichrist, and any rebel as a messenger of the true faith or a long-awaited savior. Even the Don, this free Cossack territory, felt Moscow's suffocating grip. The Tsarist government tried to limit Cossack autonomy, deprive them of their right to self-governance, and turn them into obedient service people. This caused a quiet irritation among those accustomed to living by their own laws, who saw independence as the highest value. The border between the Muscovite Tsardom and the Wildfields had always been a zone of tension, but now this tension reached a critical point. Thus, by the time Stepan Razin appeared, the country was a powder keg. Strangled by the tight corset of serfdom and exorbitant taxes, torn by religious and social contradictions, Russian society lived in a state of constant tension. Anyone who dared to challenge the system, who promised deliverance from oppression, immediately became a beacon of hope for tens and hundreds of thousands of the dispossessed. It was an era when despair fueled legends, and rumors of a good Tsar, or his savior, spread with the speed of a steppe fire. It was this pervasive crisis, and not only the Ottomans' personal revenge, that created the ideal conditions for a modest outlaw enterprise to turn into a colossal upheaval for all of Russia. This pervasive crisis, like a tightening spiral, was merely waiting for its center, its catalyst. And Stepan Razin, a man who could see not only pain but also opportunity, did not hesitate to exploit it. His path to a grand uprising began not with fiery speeches about freedom, but with far more prosaic, yet no less audacious ventures that were, in essence, carefully planned schemes. The first such step, which transformed him from an ordinary Cossack ataman into a figure to be reckoned with, was the famous campaign for plunder in 1667. This was not a spontaneous raid. Razin gathered several hundred desperate, hungry people around him, runaway serfs, bonded servants, and impoverished Cossacks. He promised them easy spoils, and they followed him to the Volga and then to the Caspian Sea. After capturing Yaitsky town, a strategically important fortress, and entrenching himself there, he transformed his detachments into a true army. For 2 years, until 1669, Razin's forces terrorized trade caravans, plundered cities on the Persian coast, and defeated the Persian Shah's fleet. This was not just robbery. It was a demonstration of strength, audacity, and impunity. Razin not only returned to the Don with untold riches, gold, silver, jewels, but also with thousands of new fighters, attracted by his fame and the spoils. He showed that he could provide for his people, that he was lucky and elusive. This scheme, in essence, was his initial investment in future power. He acquired capital, an army, and, most importantly, a reputation as an invincible and generous leader. But the true genius of his gamble manifested in 1670, when he, no longer just a bandit, but a leader with serious power, began his movement on the Volga, transforming it from a mere robbery into a people's uprising. It was then that Razin launched the grandest and most cynical mystification. He understood perfectly well that mere calls for plunder would not unite millions. An idea was needed, a legend capable of mobilizing the desperate. And he devised one. Rumors, and then open declarations, emerged that Razin was leading Tsarevich Alexei Alexeyevich, the son of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, who had supposedly escaped death, and Patriarch Nikon, freed from imprisonment. This was a subtle calculation. The people, mired in serfdom and church schism, believed in a good Tsar who was unaware of the people's suffering and would come to their aid. Tsarevich Alexei was an ideal symbol of such hope. He represented legitimate authority that would side with the people against the boyars and voivodes. And Patriarch Nikon, a figure hated by the official church but revered by old believers as a martyr for the true faith, was a lure for millions of schismatics who saw the Tsarist government as the Antichrist. Razin did not just promise freedom, he promised it in the name of a higher, correct authority. He did not oppose the Tsar, no. He allegedly restored justice in the name of the Tsar and the true church. This was a masterful play on the deepest fears and aspirations of the Russian people. His incendiary proclamations, appeals disseminated throughout the country, carried these false tidings, reinforcing the myth of the good Tsarevich and the true patriarch. He himself, or his close associates, staged spectacles before the people, displaying the Tsarevich and patriarch, who were, in reality, impostors, from behind curtains, not allowing the crowd to examine them closely. This deception worked flawlessly. People readily believed in a miracle, in salvation from above. They followed Razin, not just hoping for plunder, but believing they were participating in a holy war for truth and justice, sanctioned by the Tsarevich himself. This grandiose mystification allowed him not only to gather an army, but to create a mass movement that encompassed dozens of cities and hundreds of villages, paralyzing entire regions of the Muscovite Tsardom. It was not a revolt of the desperate, but a crusade of the deceived, led by a calculating adventurer. At first glance, Stepan Razin seemed merely a successful ataman, but his true strength lay in his deep understanding of human psychology and his masterful command of manipulative tools. He didn't just lead the desperate. He created a powerful magnetic field around himself, exploiting every weakness and every hope of his followers. His charisma was not merely a natural gift, but a refined instrument. Razin knew how to speak to the people in their own language, promising not abstract justice but concrete, tangible benefits: land, freedom, and most importantly, plunder. He knew that a hungry and dispossessed person was easiest to attract with the prospect of easy enrichment. His campaign for plunder was not just robbery but a carefully planned business venture where each participant received their share, becoming, in essence, a shareholder in the enterprise. By distributing the immense wealth brought from the Caspian Sea, he not only ensured loyalty, but also created an aura of generosity and invincibility around himself. This was his investment in a future army, in future power. But mere greed alone wouldn't mobilize millions. Razin masterfully played on the deep, almost mystical aspirations of the people. He didn't just promise, he embodied them. When he appeared before the crowd, his behavior, his words, even his appearance, everything worked to create the image of a national liberator. He was not a detached leader. He was a father ataman who understood their pain. He allowed rumors of his holiness or special destiny to spread, without refuting them. These whispers turned into legends that worked for him more effectively than any proclamations. His technology of influence was multifaceted. In addition to the aforementioned incendiary proclamations, he actively used living experts, the very impostors posing as Tsarevich Alexei and Patriarch Nikon. By displaying them from behind curtains, he not only sustained the myth of the legitimacy of his rebellion, but also created an effect of mystery and excitement. People believed they were seeing something sacred, that they were partaking in a great secret. This theatrical device allowed him to avoid exposure while simultaneously strengthening faith in a miracle. Any doubts were drowned in the general tide of jubilation and hope. Razin was a brilliant crowd psychologist. He understood that a mass movement required a constant emotional fuel. He organized public executions of hated boyars and voivodes, demonstrating his resolve and ruthlessness towards the enemies of the people. These acts of cruelty, though horrifying, served as a powerful tool of intimidation for opponents and cohesion for supporters, who saw them as an act of retribution. He knew how to channel popular anger, directing it towards specific goals, transforming spontaneous indignation into organized fury. But perhaps the most striking feature of Stepan Razin was his incredible adaptability. He began as an ordinary Cossack ataman, then transformed into a successful pirate. And when he realized that the scale of his ambitions required more, he unhesitatingly reformatted his business into a holy crusade. He was not constrained by ideology. He was a pragmatist who changed masks as needed. His ability to maintain strict discipline in his motley, often anarchic army, consisting of runaway serfs, bonded servants, and Cossacks, testifies to his outstanding organizational skills and iron will. He knew how to be generous, but also ruthless, and this balance of fear and hope allowed him to maintain control over tens of thousands of people, turning them into a unified, albeit fragile, instrument of his will. He was not just an ataman, but a master of deception and inspiration, who forged human despair into a weapon for his own ascent. But even the most skilled manipulator does not operate in a vacuum. Behind the grand spectacle staged by Stepan Razin stood not only the deceived masses, but also very specific beneficiaries, as well as those whose interests were diametrically opposed to his own. This story is not just about a rebel in a shi'ar, but about a complex web of relationships where everyone sought to snatch their peace or defend their place in the sun. Stepan Razin was merely the tip of an iceberg, driven by the deep currents of Russian society. His army, this motley crowd, was not just an instrument, but living proof of who truly benefited from his audacious enterprises. The first and most obvious beneficiaries were, of course, the thousands of runaway serfs, bonded servants, and impoverished Cossacks, the very golitba that flocked to him from all corners of the country. For them, the promise of freedom and land was not an empty phrase, but a real hope for deliverance from serfdom and hunger. Razin's campaigns, especially his Caspian raids, brought untold riches, which the ataman generously shared. Gold, silver, fabrics, weapons, all were distributed among his troops, turning yesterday's paupers into people with at least some property and, most importantly, a sense of self-worth, albeit purchased at the price of plunder. However, not only the dispossessed followed him. In the initial stages, when Razin did not yet pose a threat to statehood, but merely profited, on the outskirts, some representatives of the Cossack elders might have turned a blind eye to his actions, or even derived indirect benefit from them. The free trade of stolen goods, the influx of money into the Don, the weakening of Moscow's influence on the borders, all this could have been in their interest. They saw him as a dangerous but still manageable player, capable of diverting the central authorities' attention from Cossack liberties. This was a delicate balance that was maintained until Razin's ambitions escalated into a full-scale rebellion, threatening not only Tsarist authority, but also the well-being of the Cossack elite itself. On the other side of the conflict stood the mighty machine of the Muscovite Tsardom, led by Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, known as the Quietist. For him and his entourage, Stepan Razin was not just a brigand, but a challenge to the very foundation of statehood. Tsar Alexei was a ruler who sought to strengthen centralized power, suppress any manifestations of willfulness, and complete the process of encirclement. Razin's rebellion directly threatened all these goals. Every captured city, every incendiary proclamation, every rumor of Tsarevich Alexei undermined the authority of the czarist power and sowed chaos. The main executors of the czar's will in the provinces were the voivodes, governors with immense powers, responsible for order and tax collection. They were the first to face the wave of Razin's revolt. Prince Yuri Dolgorukov, whose name was already mentioned in connection with the execution of Razin's brother, became one of the key antagonists of the uprising. His actions, such as the brutal reprisal against the Cossacks and the execution of Ivan Razin, not only fueled Stepan's personal revenge, but also became a symbol of the arbitrary rule of the czarist administration, pouring oil on the fire of popular indignation. When the rebellion gained strength, Dolgorukov, commanding government troops, found himself at the epicenter of the struggle. It was his troops who were to stop Razin near Simbirsk, in the very battle that became a turning point in the history of the revolt. But Dolgorukov was not the only one. As the rebellion grew, other voivodes joined the fight, such as Prince Grigory Romodanovsky, who commanded troops on the southern borders and actively participated in suppressing the revolt. The czarist government spared no effort or expense. Regular troops, noble militias, streltsy, musketeers, and Cossacks loyal to the Tsar were dispatched to suppress the revolt. This was not merely a police operation but a full-scale war, where the very existence of the state was at stake. A special place in this drama was occupied by the Cossack elders, the wealthy Cossacks to whom Razin himself belonged. Initially, they might have been interested in weakening Moscow's control, but when Stepan's rebellion transformed from a successful raid into a threat to the entire system, including their own privileges and property, their position sharply changed. For them, Razin transformed from a potential ally into a mad fanatic, capable of destroying everything they had built. It was fear for their well-being, and the desire to maintain their position that forced them to commit betrayal. They, who had recently reaped the benefits of Razin's campaigns, became his executioners, handing the ataman over to the government. This was a pragmatic choice between preserving their own power and supporting a rebel who had spiraled out of control. Thus, Stepan Razin's rebellion was not only his personal undertaking, but a grandiose chess game, where every player, from the hungry peasant to the powerful boyar, pursued their own interests, and the fate of the country hung in the balance, determined by a